What I'm going to do this evening is really talk to you about my latest book. That's the Australian cover that you see there. And I realised when I saw the American one, there's actually a bit of a story here about what publishers can do to books. Because in Australia, clouds and all that sort of stuff suggests high thoughts and wonderful, adventuring in the mind. And the subtitle, An Argument for Hope, of course, is different from the American subtitle. But when this was showed to my American publisher, he said it looked a bit too much like Watchtower magazine or something, and that maybe it carried some religious connotations that might not go over well here, so they redesigned the cover entirely. But the book came out of my attempt to answer a question that I was asked very frequently when I was talking about climate change, particularly after I'd written The Weathermakers in 2005. And that question was, what are our chances really of surviving this shift in climate that's looming and that we are causing? And the only way I could think of to answer that question was to really go back to the scientific fundamentals, to go back to the process that created us and our planet, and of course look at the intersection between our species and this thing that we call planet Earth, because it's at that intersection that the issue of sustainability arises. And I couldn't think a better way really of starting to look at the issue than to go back to the work of that man there. That's Charles Darwin's tombstone in Westminster Abbey, the great kind of sacred house for all of the great men of the British and women of the British people. It tells you something that he was buried in the church, in the great house, but nothing is said on his tombstone of his achievements. It's sort of pretty unique actually among all the monuments in the Abbey that you wouldn't guess why he was there. Obviously what he had done and written about with the theory of evolution was not kindly looked upon by his own church. The reason I wanted to start with Darwin was because he's the man who really explained to us what the process that made us and the process that made our Earth. And his idea, his great idea, was an extremely simple one. It was simply that in every generation there is variation between individuals, and that some of those individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce than others, and that over the vastness of time that people were just becoming aware of the history of the Earth in the mid-19th century, that must tell on heritability, on those which are on the shape of species as a whole, as he put it. So it was a very, very simple idea. But Darwin, being a very wise man, I think, a very perceptive person, decided to sit on that idea for 20 years. And it was only when I went to Darwin's house in Kent that I really understood a little bit more about why he waited so long before he announced this fundamental idea that changed our view of the world. Just outside his house, he built a little thing that he called the sand walk. And that's it there. It's actually a pebble walk. I don't know why he called it the sand walk, but there you go. Even great men can do odd things. And every day of his life at Down House, he would walk for several hours around that sand walk. And people have wondered why he did it. What was he thinking about? What was he doing as he walked around that racetrack, really? It's just a loop around the forest there. Scientists have speculated that maybe he was perfecting his arguments or constructing in his head the beautiful paragraphs and sentences that characterise his written work. But the testimony of his children suggests something very different. They left memoirs where they talked about what they knew of their father, and they would play in the forest there and often interrupt him as they were doing so. And he always seemed glad of the interruption. He'd sometimes join their games where they were kicking a ball or whatever they were doing. And they are not the actions, I would say, of a man who is deeply engaged in very complex and critical thought. I think what Darwin was doing as he wandered the sand walk was metaphorically fingering his worry beads. He was thinking about the implication of his theory for religious belief in his country, for the shape of civil society, and other deep matters. I guess at base what he was worried about was that if he destroyed faith by showing that we were not the unique creation of a loving and caring God, but instead were the result of an amoral and utterly cruel process, that by destroying faith he might destroy hope and charity as well and have a very adverse impact upon his society. He may never have published his theory if it hadn't been for this man here. In 1858, 20 years after Darwin first stumbled on the idea of how we and every other living thing on the planet was made, this man here, Alfred Russel Wallace, was working in Indonesia. He was a man 20 years younger than Darwin. He was a working class lad, self-made, went to the tropics to collect biological specimens. And while he was there on the island of Ternate, he had a malarial attack, and as a result of that malarial attack, as he was highly fevered, the idea came to him that perhaps species were created by exactly the same mechanism that Darwin had chanced upon 20 years earlier. When he recovered enough from his malaria to write, he wrote a note to Darwin in great excitement outlining his theory and asked Darwin if he wouldn't mind transmitting it to one of the journals to be published in Britain. Well, when Darwin received the letter, he was horrified. He said, Wallace couldn't have made a better précis or summary of my work if he'd had my notes in front of him. And he thought perhaps that his whole life's work was about to be stolen by this upstart, this working class lad. As it was, he appealed to his friends, particularly those who looked after journal publications and so forth, including Charles Lyell, the great geologist. And as a result of their intervention, both pieces of work were co-published in July 1858, both Darwin's and Wallace's, and it is extraordinary how similar they are. The theory is presented in fullness and completeness in both accounts. But for all of that, it was like a squib going off in British society. No one took any notice. In fact, the man who was in charge of publishing the journal, Professor Bell, who was an expert on the stalk-eyed crustacea, wrote in his summary of the year 1858 that there'd been no significant scientific discoveries really published in the journal that year, nothing that would revolutionise the Department of Science that they bear upon. Of course, he couldn't have been more wrong, and that was showed the following year in 1859 when Darwin published his book on the origin of species. And then, as Darwin perhaps feared, with the theory unleashed upon his society, everything began to change. Within 5 years, Herbert Spencer had coined the term the survival of the fittest, and social Darwinism had been born. Darwin didn't really help his own cause in the subtitle he picked for the book, which included the line on the preservation of favoured races. And I can imagine going into a bookshop in 1859, as an average sort of Englishman, and picked up this book and on the preservation of favoured races. I wouldn't have been thinking about worms that were just slightly better at being worms, as the favoured races, right? You'd be thinking about British empire builders, wouldn't you, out in India and stuff like that, And so there was this social impact. And over time, I think what we saw was a very, very deep impact on our society by these Darwinian ideas. Everything from National Socialism to eugenics, through, I would argue, to neoclassical economics, have borne some imprint of Darwinian thinking, particularly as mediated through the likes of Herbert Spencer. So as I was beginning to look at the process that created us, reread Dawkins' Selfish Gene, reread Darwin, and began to despair that perhaps we were selfish, short-sighted, ruthless entities forged by an amoral and utterly cruel process. But it was this man here that really gave me hope that that may not necessarily be the case.